Whether it's something as global as the US presidential race or more grassroots, like the local council campaigns currently underway here in Victoria, it seems that everyone has a case of the election fever at the moment. The Sunshine State is next on the election dance card, and after a landslide victory to the Country Liberal Party in the recent Northern Territory election, and the LNP predicted to win back power in Queensland, many are monitoring the polls to see what they may predict for the upcoming federal election early next year. Joining us for a couple of thoughts on the Queensland election is Nicholas O'Connor, Managing Director at INSIGNIS, whose campaign history includes experiences running campaigns in the UK, New Zealand, Namibia, and now Brisbane. Nick joins us to break down the key seats in play, the policy differences between the two major parties, and what, if any, impact the Queensland election will have on federal outcomes. With us today is a man on the ground in Queensland, Nick O'Connor. Welcome for a couple of thoughts on the Queensland election. My first question to you is, where are we at? When is the election for those who aren't living in Queensland or haven't been paying attention? And how long into campaigning are we?
The election is October 26. So the official caretaker period started about a week ago. But, we've had unofficial campaigning probably a month before that. So we're really getting into that final 2.5 weeks now.
So what are some of the major issues and policies that are being debated or discussed currently between both the major parties but also some of the minor parties as well?
So at the very forefront of all kind of Queensland voters is cost of living crisis. It's the majority issue. Now, the different parties have actually taken different tacks with how they approach that. But one of the things that you'll see is that the LNP main messaging is actually towards youth crime. So they are obviously talking about cost of living, but their actual main track, their main campaign messaging is towards youth crime. And it's gaining a lot of traction. So that's one of those issues. In a broader sense, it's kind of not so unique from anywhere else in Australia. It is cost of living, housing issues, and now crime. So crime has shot up to the third biggest issue. Housing in Queensland is quite noticeable since COVID because basically Brisbane had a massive boom during the COVID years with a lot of Victorians, New South Wales people moving up. And I think Brisbane housing prices increased at a magnitude of around 20% year on year over that period. So fundamentally, it's created a lot of unaffordability, big rental issues here in Brisbane.
So we saw the Country Liberal Party in Northern Territory win in a landslide, and they went so heavy on crime and picking up the issue of crime in Northern Territory. Do you think Queensland's taking a leaf out of that book and the success that they had there in the Northern Territory, using that as a sort of cornerstone of the election?
To be honest, I think we've been actually focused in on that for as long time ourselves. So when you think of Queensland, there really is kind of lots of different segments to Queensland. There is Brisbane and the southeast, but there is also what we call regional Queensland. That's also central and North Queensland. And it has been fundamentally a massive issue in those areas, which kind of align with kind of like the Northern Territory in the sense of population and so on. But crime has been a massive issue. And fundamentally carjackings, home invasions, all of these issues have just become the news since COVID. That has been everywhere. And it's been kind of a lot of it's been started by people setting up security cameras and uploading that footage to social media. So it's now a self-fulfilling prophecy of crime issues because it has become a trend on social media, the amount of crime that you can witness in these regional areas. And it's very, very confronting.
And just on that, Nick, I know from your background you've been involved in a number of different elections across different jurisdictions, even internationally. How do political parties, when they're about to go into an election, how do they choose the topics that they're going to run with, that they're going to campaign hard on?
There isn't like a hard science behind this, but what I would say is there is two kind of aspects. It's door knocking, understanding what constituents are kind of saying at the door. I think that's a really important thing, and that kind of starts from that grassroots level. So that's one factor. And then there's the second factor, which is through polling. So that is a big thing that kind of sways politicians. It's kind of like that retail understanding of it, but also what the data says. And I think increasingly data is more important, but in these kind of like elections where, particularly in Queensland, where it's particularly a decentralized state, I think door knocking and retail groundswell opinions is very important. And particularly in this election, where a lot of the marginal seats are in regional Queensland, it's much easier to get the data from the actual ground roots rather than actually doing general polling, which would kind of tend to be more saturated in Brisbane.
We've also seen with the candidates and nomination forms being finalised that there's been an increase in smaller party running members. So Family First and Legalised Cannabis have both had increase in total numbers of candidates running across seats. And we've actually had a decrease in independents. When you join that with the fact that the Katter Party is obviously the stronghold in North Queensland and the Greens are running a candidate in every seat now in all 93 seats. Does this tell us something about the fracturing away from the major two parties in Queensland? And could you explain maybe why there's a bit of a less of an independent movement in Queensland as well currently?
Based on the federal election results, you've seen that Queensland, to a lot of people's surprise, actually selected Greens candidates. And there is Greens candidates in what I would call inner west, quite wealthy areas. So I would say basically the independent movement that you saw in New South Wales and Victoria was taken over by the Greens in Queensland. So they're perceived as the same, particularly because the Greens have never had a particular strong basis in state politics or anything like that. They're not considered real politicians. They're still kind of considered activists or grassroots campaigners. So the Greens basically absorbed that independent thing. What I think is interesting is I don't think the Greens have particularly improved upon their high water result in the federal election, but they haven't decreased either. So I think current polling is trending them around 12% on state polls, and they were previously at 9%. The interesting thing is to see is how Labor can solidify their vote in inner Brisbane. And that is going to be where the change is. So obviously there's probably 6 seats in inner Brisbane that are at play for the Greens at the moment. And so Labor is pretty much given up the fight in several seats, assuming that the Greens are going to win. So the seat of McConnell, which is Brisbane Central, the long-term Labor candidate has given up. Like, they are very certain that the Greens are going to win there. There's also seats alongside there where, you know, if the current polling is to hold, you would think that maybe Greens will win 1 or 2 more seats. So that could create, for the first time, a core of Green seats in the state parliament, which hasn't really existed before.
And are there other key seats outside of Brisbane that are going to be influential in deciding this election?
There's always been this fascinating, basically, messaging that has to exist in Queensland, which is the marginal seats tend to be in outer Brisbane, the corridors between Brisbane, central Queensland and North Queensland. So basically those have always been the marginal seats. Brisbane has always kind of tended to go with the party of government, and that is kind of like what is so interesting. So the LNP has to keep its messaging broadly aimed at regional marginal seats, and it has to allow its Brisbane candidates to speak more from a Brisbane perspective, because Christodoulou cannot. So if Christodoulou comes out with like very pro-Brisbane kind of content, it will not fly. And so marginal seats in particular that you're looking at is Bundaberg. So Christodoulou started his campaign in Bundaberg. I think it's currently held by Labor by 9 votes. That is those swing areas that we're talking about. In Bundaberg, the main kind of issues is obviously cost of living, lack of government services, and also, you know, everything that kind of holds true to what the current debate is about: housing, affordability, and crime. So those are the areas which have to be taken by the LNP. This is the thing that Queensland does so uniquely. Don't really like minority governments. We like having a big personality in charge. So from that, we tend to hammer away with governments. So if a government's in, they're in, and we're going to give them plenty of votes for that. But if we're not happy with that government, there will be massive swings. So when there has been changes of government over the last 20 years, like, swings have been massive. And you can look at 2012 and 2015 as a great example of that. So there was a collective swing, I think upwards of like 15% either way. So Queensland, it very much likes big personality premiers. It's not important who's in the cabinet. These aren't as primary issues. It's very presidential in that sense.
Where are we sitting at the moment in the current polling? What do you think is the most likely result from here?
I think it's a 95% certainty of an LNP victory. Because the simple thing is, Miles is not an unlikable person. But that's not the issue. He has terrible polling numbers on the job that he's done. And is that because he's he's been doing a particularly bad job? I think it's frustration after 10 years of government, and things are generally worse than what they were. And that's how people vote. I mean, it's a very simple thing, and it's something that holds true in all political campaigns, is people go, am I better off than what I was last year? And 50% of Queenslanders have strongly said that they, in polling by Freshwater Strategy, have said that I'm significantly worse off. And that is the reality of it. It's really not about Miles and what he's done. It's more about there has to be a different approach. The LNP campaign has been incredibly tight. There has been very strong focus towards their 5 points that they want to address, and they have not moved off that. That's why there's been a lot of wedge tactics, and they're trying to see if Christopher Lee will move off it, but I don't think he's going to. And because I think inherently Queenslanders don't think that their rights are going to be impacted by Christopher Lee government.
And you mentioned there that they've run a very tight campaign. The ALP has been criticising the LNP's campaign for a lack of, policy diversity or policy detail. Similarly, however, the ALP is very light on details of their own policies, to be frank. Should we expect any more, fleshing out of some of the health plans or cost living plans that have been touted as top level? Or will this be more of your personality campaigns the next couple of weeks?
I don't think there'll be massive amounts of policy detail coming through. I think the focus is on personality, but if I was to give a personal opinion, this has been a quiet campaign. There's not been that many clashes. I think that Miles is doing as much as he can with the outcomes of 10 years of Labor in government. Christopher Lee's made a lot of commitments to avoiding the scare campaign tactics that could come from the previous LNP government. So, for example, Christopher Lee has consistently pledged there will be no privatisation, there will be no labour for hire issues, there will be and has drilled into the detail of what no privatisation means, because it is such an effective tactic for Labor. So even despite that, we're seeing basically the health sector attack ads coming from the unions, but also from Labor, saying that the LNP will privatise healthcare. And, it's not going to happen. But, these are effective concerns for health workers, and you can understand why Labor's running them. What you see really coming to the fore from this kind of campaign is basically there is some negative ads, there is some of that strategy, but it's probably not as negative as previous campaigns. It's rather quiet. I won't say dull. I love politics for it to be ever considered dull, but I think it's quiet.
So if we put our corporate affairs hats on for a minute, if we are heading towards a change of government, what does that mean for businesses? And if there is a change of government, what should they do differently? Is there anything they need to do as a new government comes into play?
With my corporate affairs government relations hat on, I think it's very important that you have people who understand how the LNP works and their viewpoint of the world. Queensland has not had the LNP in government for at least 11 years, but even before then, there's not a strong institutional representation of LNP-based people in a lot of government bodies and such. So fundamentally, there has to be a big learning curve for Queensland organisations or Australian organisations with dealing with an LNP government and understanding that the language in which you want to communicate your issues. So I think this LNP government's going to be very open to discussions with everyone. I don't think they're going to be switching anything off. I've actually saw Christopherly at a Queensland Community Alliance. So the Queensland Community Alliance is a combination of trade unions, faith-based groups, and multicultural organisations. And so Christopherly was engaging with the trade unions. So if Christopherly is doing that, and this is a couple of weeks ago, they're open, and that he actually brought in 3 or 4 of his shadow ministers. So they're very open for business, but I think what organisations need to do is to understand the language of the Liberal Party and kind of portray their points in a way that makes sense.
And in preparation for, as you've predicted in terms of polling, a massive landslide win to the LNP, do you think that will have long-term effects on the health or the strength of the ALP in Queensland in the future? We know that candidates like Shannon Fentiman, who's the current health minister, might lose what was previously a safe seat. There's a predicted 13% swing there. And there's other members, I suppose, of what's been called like the young guard of the ALP, who are predicted or bookmarked to be the future leaders of the party in Queensland, also in tough races to keep their seats. If they all end up losing their seats and it's a very different looking Labor Party going forward, how do you think that will change how organisations and businesses should be thinking about planning about future election cycles as well?
I kind of always think that it's oversold the death of political parties, particularly Queensland. That's the birthplace of the ALP. So, I mean, even when Labor had a horrendous result in 2012, and they were down to single digits as MPs, they won the next election. Yes, it's going to be a great victory to the LNP, but will it be a 2012 result? I wouldn't think so. I think it'll be a little bit tighter than that. And I think that's necessarily a good thing, actually, as well. I'm not fundamentally concerned for Labor's youth development, nor would I be for the LNP's youth development if it was vice versa.
We've also got a federal election coming up, likely early next year. Is the result of this Queensland state election potentially a predictive barometer for that election, or will it have an effect of some sort on the federal election?
I think there's always been a separation of state and federal results in Queensland, and that's always been quite distinctive. Labor's never really cracked into a large percentage of the federal votes available in Queensland, but have been in state government for almost 30 years. So I think there is a distinction between the federal and state views, and I think you've seen actually that Peter Dutton and Albanese have not wanted to go anywhere near this Queensland election because they don't want to be associated with the result. I'd also would say that it doesn't bear that much resemblance to what's coming. I think the federal election is much tighter. There's different issues at play, and yeah, I think people vote differently because this is much more of a presidential, when I think actually in federal elections, people do care about ministers and cabinets and actual policies more. So just a bit more, but yes, I do think so.